Hello, welcome everybody to the Doomer Optimism podcast. This is our 100th episode. And today, our special guest is Ashley Colby. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Jason. Yeah, we decided to just reserve this particular episode for reflection between I guess I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're kind of the founders since we stumbled into the term together, although I feel
Mhm.
like a lot of people in our little circle have quite a bit of ownership
Mhm.
over the Doomer Optimism project.
Yeah.
So what do we want to talk about today, Jason?
Well, I think you brought up an interesting topic. I think we can reflect on how it's gone. This is our 100th episode. Uh, and we initially set out for it to be kind of like a collective. And I think it kind of feels that way, right? It seems like a lot of people have taken ownership of the project. A lot of people set up interviews, for example, on the podcast. Um, and so that feels really good.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. What do you think? Does Doomer Optimism feel like a collective to you?
Yeah, I think I don't know. People have been coming around to it, and I'm feeling more and more, or I guess more than ever, um, like I guess I haven't said this to you, but it is like starting to get more amorphous as more people come in.
Hmm.
Like, what is it exactly?
Yeah.
It initially started, I think, with people who were more or less like us,
Yeah.
um, homesteaders, and as we've broadened out, um, I'm like getting less and less clear about what it is, like what it is that's
Yeah.
drawing people in. Um,
Well, I don't know if it's anything really. Like we keep using the term. We created a Twitter account for it. We keep saying it's something. So it must be something. Uh, but are we drawing people in? We're definitely interviewing a lot of people, and
yeah,
oftentimes we say in the Doomer Optimism sphere. But does that actually mean anything? I don't know. I don't know if it needs to mean anything. Uh,
I don't know either. But then then you run the risk of being like this totally psychotic constructivist who like says nothing's really real and it's all just like in our heads. And it's not. I don't think we're just pretending that people like, I mean, people are DMing me saying like, thank you so much for this podcast. It's such
mm,
a like almost every day I get a DM from someone. I got two today. People are just like,
yeah,
thank you for what you do. You're like the most sane people I've come across.
nice.
Um, so that I'm not making up.
Hmm.
That's real. But what is it that they're drawn to? I'm just like less and less sure.
Yeah.
Especially, I guess, as I myself am struggling with like just how psychotic everything's getting in the world and trying to keep my wits about me.
Yeah, well, you had that tweet recently that you feel like the last normal person on Earth, and you're having a lot of cognitive dissonance of how
Yeah.
crazy everyone's becoming. But you moved your family to Uruguay like a few years ago. That's not a very
Yeah.
normal thing to do.
No, although, okay, I guess this is a good tee up for me. A couple of people have asked me to tell my Uruguay story, and I can briefly describe it here. Um, I do think um, so like in 2000 and well basically as soon as I was an adult, I started learning in college about like sustainability things.
Mhm.
I took this class in college called Is Development Sustainable? Like if it's development at all, is it sustainable? And the answer to the question of the class was no, it's not sustainable if it's development, basically, at least not in our current paradigm, like just growth in general.
Mhm.
um and then just went on this whole long rabbit hole of realizing like societies collapse.
Mhm.
um and when they do collapse, the closer you are to the most hyper complex part of it, the worse you're probably going to fare. It just in terms of like people, what complexity breaks down, people are used to it and they don't really have the tools to deal with that.
Mhm.
And so that's my doomer side. And so I always thought like I got to get out of the center of the empire, basically.
Mhm.
Um, if I really actually believe a lot of this environmental economic data. And then, our whole like young adulthood was like one disaster after another that people thought was just impossible. Like Hurricane Katrina was a big one, where it was just like, this is just impossible. Like, how is this even happening in our advanced society? So anyways, moving to Uruguay is like the sane and normal response to that. If that is your premise, moving to a place that's like calm and stable and outside of the blast zone is like the normal thing to do.
Can wait. So then can we, if we all want to be normal, can we all move to Uruguay?
Well, yeah, I mean, everyone can get out of the empire. I mean, most people can get out of the empire. All immigration is some story of people like escaping, usually escaping something that they perceive to be untenable. I also think like I probably didn't consider enough the potential to be in places like where you are, or like the driftless of Wisconsin, like in the nooks and crannies within the borders of empire, but like outside of where anyone really cares about. I was just too just concerned that just being within the border, like just to be able to get health care is like, oh wait,
you're freezing up a little bit, but I could say, while
can you still hear me?
I can hear you a little bit now.
Testing.
Well, you were correct in the sense you said blast zone.
Hello. Am I back?
Yeah, I think so.
Testing.
Yeah, but you said the blast zone, like when everybody for a brief period, maybe we still should be worried about nuclear war. You definitely probably are outside the blast zone, whereas I'm not. So you have that going for you.
Yep.
It's a pretty good thing.
And I also think like just little stuff. Yeah, and I don't want to be like insanely doomer, but if you follow the things that I've read, this is like the one of the obvious conclusions. Although it doesn't come without its costs, like just living in a different culture, a different language. But like just the extent to which I'm not swimming upstream culturally, like a lot of the kids are just extremely wholesome around here. People are very wholesome. It feels like whenever I post about it on Twitter, people are like, what is going on in this little corner of the world? And it is like, it's almost like what people idealize about like small towns in like the 50s or 60s or 70s. Like we grew up, like all the kids ride their bikes everywhere. They ride their bikes to school. Right. There's little parades. There's little, like togetherness. So that's actually all very, very normal.
Right.
Even though it's weird for me as an American, I guess, to be
Well, let me ask you this. A lot of people get online because they feel alienated from where they are, but you're saying that where you are is very wholesome, and yet you're very active online. And it's causing you a lot of cognitive dissonance. So explain your psychology to me and to the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a good Doomer Optimism question in general. So like where I live is a super wholesome, very nice, small town. I have friends here who are lovely families, but I am missing some cultural context with them. Like they're not from the US, they didn't grow up the way that I did. So like there's some, inside jokes to be made about cultural things of, people who are my age who were raised in the US that I can't make. And then the flip side of that is I feel alienated also where I'm from in a different direction, which is just like everybody's so hyper consumeristic, and I'm painting with broad brushes, but just like this feeling like you're just swimming against the tide in terms of like conviviality and neighborliness and that kind of thing. So going online, initially I was just like following election news in 2020 on Twitter, but I found other people like you, Jason, and like other people in our little sphere who I was like, wow, I guess there's more of us. I mean, I only kind of came across other people like me randomly throughout my life, and like you know, a couple of different friends who have like bought pieces of land.
Yeah.
But I didn't like realize there were a lot more of us, and it was just so nice to be able to like constantly interact with people who are thinking through the same kinds of things.
Hmm.
Which is kind of we're actually kind of a niche group, even though I think more and more people are signing on. And I mean, like, how would you define what draws people in to
Um,
us?
well, I think it is the recognition, whether it's our enculturation and our need for a lot of stimulus all the time, or whether it's that general alienation in society and dissolving of strong community bonds that
Yeah,
a lot of us are self-described localists. We're trying to encourage convivial local life and mutual interdependence, but at the same time, we're not satisfied with that.
yeah,
We want those dopamine hits. We want the intellectual stimulation. We want to talk about I don't know, Benjamin Franklin and Juntos or whatever.
yeah. Wait, hold on though. I would push back on the dopamine thing though, although
uh,
it is true. I agree it's true, but I think that might be too crass of a description in terms of like the totality of what it does, because I think it's like have you ever been, well, at least okay, in my experience I was in like a college classroom. There were a couple times where it was just like so magical, like everybody's like debating but in like this good faith way, and it's like super stimulating, and you get these like different people in the different groups who like represent certain points of view, and you see them all like interacting, and you're learning so much from them interacting, and then you finally get a good point that you want to add, and everyone's like recognizes it and it moves the discussion along. Like
mhm,
it's a like a simulacrum of that on Twitter,
mhm.
where you're like you get the best, you can get a little bit taste of like what it's like to be in those kind of like intellectually stimulating conversations.
Right, but it's a form of intellectual stimulation that is very characteristic of modernity for the most part, right? Um,
Yeah,
I'm guessing
yeah,
pre-modernity, you had learning institutions, you had monasteries, but it was a very thin slice of the population who engaged with that. Um,
yeah,
but we're enculturated to crave, this what is the outside context, what is, the big picture. Um, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm not trying to say that's a bad thing, but it is kind of interesting, if we take that the medium is the message, that the nature of our conversations being about localization, among other things, is happening over this globalist platform, is basically what it is, and
yeah,
we enjoy it and we don't want to give it up. And I
yeah.
think, I don't know, for me, like thinking through that, like what does that mean, or what could it mean, has been very fruitful. Um, I think it's recognizing that we don't hate all of modernity. That I would like to maintain some kind of communication infrastructure, global communication infrastructure, not just for intellectual reasons. I think also for practical, logistical reasons. I think it's important, but there's a cost to that as well. Um, the in order to maintain all the technical infrastructure to keep a global internet alive, in order to mine all the materials and get all the energy to do that, there has to be sacrifice zones. And so, what does that mean? I don't know.
I mean, I think like for me, yeah, the whole debate of like, oh, you want to be a homesteader, therefore you need to like use hand tools for everything. Like I don't, that whole thing is just a very boring
Mhm.
discussion. However, um yeah, if you are going to use a technology, how to use it well, and especially like to serve the ends that we're all seeking,
Mhm.
is like right where most of us are like struggling, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Not just struggling, but this is where many of us exist and what we're like trying to think about on the day-to-day basis. I just think, like, as long as you can keep your wits about you, big asterisk there, it can be just really like a both and great scenario where you're like, make sure you don't take too much time on the internet, make sure you but you like use it with good measure. Like what a lovely life to like actually dig into your physicality and learn how to live like within, even if they're like self-imposed natural limits, while simultaneously like enjoying really fun, the most fruitful discussions maybe potentially happening, who knows, like at least happening legibly online. I think it's just such a lovely thing if you can keep your balance about you, though. That's a big question. And I'm like just paying attention to things on the internet. Like I'm just so it's very hard to know what to tune out until you've seen enough of it, and then you're like, okay, I don't want any more, like I don't need to know any more about this discourse. How do I get it out of my brain? And even then the tool isn't great for like staying away from it.
Yeah. Well, so that's to me, like the two core aspects of Doomer Optimism, one is the panarchy, systems cycles model of kind of collapse and regeneration and recognizing sustainability, and the other half is the cosmolocal kind of theory of change that's just implicit, whether people want to deny it or not, or make fun of it or not. It is, we are unwittingly or wittingly participating in a cosmolocal kind of dialogue, right? If you post a picture online of your donkeys, you're engaging in a cosmolocal kind of activity. And so what does that mean in terms of like in terms of healthy, if we go forward, healthy local communities where there's a good flow in and out of information to kind of keep things fresh and interesting, but there's also a good endogenous internal generation of value and knowledge and energy, and finding that balance, as you said. Like I don't think any of us have figured out how to do that, right? Because if you're bringing in too much from the outside, especially if it's like, okay, I'm trying to be a community builder, but I'm the only one engaged with these discussions, then I'm already kind of alienating myself a little bit, because if I try and talk to somebody else about them, they're not really going to understand, so I'm like, how do I take these insights, if I'm getting insights from being online, and translate them to a local community context without disrupting the endogenous, traditional cultural landscape processes that are already happening. That's the thing. Like, what does that mean? Like, this is a completely fundamentally new phenomenon in the history of the world. I think the internet is fundamentally new, but using the internet to try and localize is also fundamentally new.
Yes. Wait, before we go into that, and I do want to come back to that question, I wonder if we can explicitly say what some of our assumptions are, because I think we just toss around words like localism, and we have spoken to some extent about our assumptions, but I think a lot of people crave this, us explicitly saying what we think is happening in the world. And I keep saying it over and over again on Twitter, but one of my assumptions is we're in an era where we had like access to just abundant energy, fossil fuel energy. And that's a finite resource. It cannot be like recreated. It takes a long time to do that. So in order to basically, that's just going to try if whenever that runs out, and this is called peak oil, this idea, that it will peak, the production of it will peak at some point and then decline. All sorts of things will have to change in our society as a result of that. And so right now we're seeing like so much chaos, and maybe this is a stupid, almost religious, totalizing worldview that I hold, but I feel like so much of what we're seeing is just a result of like resource scarcity issues. Fundamentally, like people are just going crazy and like seeking access to resources in one way or another. And so the upshot of that
it's not really the peasants who are going crazy. It's the hyper online, hyper modern elites who are going crazy, and they have lots of resources.
Yeah. Well, okay. So how would you describe it? Because I would personally say it has a lot to do with like the overproduction of elites and the fact that there's just like this sense that there's like less and less elite positions. And there are, like, I mean, even if you just look at like the academic job market, like there's just less and less elite positions. So then people are like scraping by for these few elite positions, and then they're just like trying to maintain relevance in some like hyper drive of like being just trying to get noticed, you know, because what is an elite really besides like producing some ideas, I guess, like a thought leader.
Yeah, well, I think we're going a bit on a tangent there, so I'll get back to that. But going back to the resource scarcity thing, so you know, there's one like Nate Higgins talks about, like this, you know, this global superorganism that's developing that nobody really has control over, and it's like this, you know, increasing in complexity. And the byproduct of that is entropy, you know, that it leaves behind due to extraction of resources, degradation of resources. Of course, the global biosphere itself, you know, is overheating, and that has many consequences. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we're just, you know, we're all kind of all kind of like ecological economists, you know, whether we know it or not, right? Like we're all kind of tapped into, we have a vision of the world, you know, that's, you know, that doesn't, you know, see the dream of infinite economic growth happening indefinitely, where you're growing 2%, you have to double in size every 30 years.
Right.
And we tend not to think, like, I think most people in society tend to implicitly assume that we're going to innovate our way out of resource scarcity. We're going to become more efficient, whether they acknowledge it or not. Because if they, you know, if they didn't believe that, at least implicitly, then they would be freaking out as well, right, about what's happening. And then there's people explicitly who believe that, like, you know, I'm thinking of somebody like Rune on Twitter, who's like the biggest, probably unabashedly techno optimist, you know, account I've ever seen. It almost feels like a parody at some point, but I think he's like dead serious, right? That we're gonna come up with the technology to sequester carbon, and we're going to mine asteroids for all the minerals we need moving forward. Et cetera, et cetera. And and so it's really, I mean, we're at a point where it's either like the singularity or die, or downshift somehow, right?
Right. And then I would just came to the realization, like, so that is like the extreme optimists, I would say, are the vast majority of society. Everybody's just told this basically story, like, we'll innovate our way out of it, don't worry, like the adults will figure it out or whatever. You know, Elon will save us or whatever. But and then the other side of the coin are the extreme doomers, who we also take aim at to some extent, because the people are saying, like, you know, there's just no solution, or they're saying like that again, they just lean into techno optimism, but like are just extremely doomeristic about the potential for thriving. Whereas I think we occupy this middle space, like it's pretty bad. There's not a lot of hope in the way things are going currently, but there is still so much you can do. And so the upshot is like all of these podcasts that we've had, like where is the in between like
you can, for example, you can produce podcasts.
Fatalist. Yeah, yes.
That's
and you
something
can try to like signal boost people who are like doing interesting things that are in that agency zone that are downshift related, basically localist related, ecologically imbalanced, trying to like get more in touch with your humanity. I try to write some things in that direction. I'm trying more and more to write things.
Yeah, you're on a tear. You're like writing for all these publications, and you're
I know. And I've been thinking about these things for a
shift
long
over
time.
to your will to power arc that you called it. That you're just kind of a beast. How do you explain that?
I think it's like somebody who I've been it's not like my brain shut off when I became a mom. I've been thinking this stuff the whole time, and like even becoming a parent, before while I was pregnant, I was like reading all these books. And even before I got pregnant, I was reading all these like anthropology books, like, all right, how do I want to approach parenting? And so like the entire time I'm like thinking about all of these things. It's like just, and during my parenting years, I was more or less like not productive in a career or vocation sense. Besides just getting my PhD and writing a book, but like that was not, I mean, just relative to, it wasn't a lot of output for like the 10-year period when I first had my daughter, my oldest. And now I'm like, I've got so many pent up things that I've been thinking for a decade that I just need to get out. And I finally have the girls are old enough now that they can like go with another adult for hours at a time, and I feel no guilt at all about it. In fact, I think it's really good for them to be with other adults at this age, help to adapt. So yeah, I just like I've got a lot of ideas I think need to be out there in the world. I don't know if that's like narcissistic to think, but I don't know, what does any writer do but like put their ideas that they think out. I don't know. It's not that weird, is it? I don't know.
Or, I mean, like, it's impressive.
Questionable.
I wouldn't call it weird. It's just like, wow, you're like, you're putting out ideas that are, reaching, maybe tickling the mainstream a little bit, or mainstream adjacent.
Yeah.
No, it's impressive. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not weird.
Yeah. Well, and I also just like, I also feel very. I haven't explicitly said this much, but like I feel pretty. There is something like survivor's guilt. Like I'm here in Uruguay living this nice idyllic life because I got access to like this information that I feel like is important for other people to potentially thrive in like a coming resource scarce future. And so I feel like kind of responsibility to at least make my attempt to get these ideas out there in a way that could potentially I do like foresee some pretty doomery things. So when I'm like talking about prepping, I'm like, it's not that big of a deal to just have some food and some water. It's almost like a responsibility type thing. Like I'm like a historical materialist in that I think the vast majority of people don't change until they have no other choice. But maybe I convince some people to think about it in advance. And then not only that, the other thing I worry about is people getting onto like some land and being really stupid in ecological terms and in disrespect for local culture terms. So I guess going back to your other thing, we can go back to that, but like, it is so weird to re-ruralize. And I actually don't know the extent to which other collapsing civilizations, certainly they did not re-ruralize at this scale. And I'm assuming they also did not urbanize at the scale that we're at.
Yeah.
I think this might be a unique point in history in terms of that.
Yeah. In terms of absolute scale, yeah, totally unique. Just, I don't know, maybe an order of magnitude larger scale than the Roman Empire. I mean, I don't, probably orders
Yeah.
of
I mean, there
magnitude.
was never a point in history where 1% of the population was involved in agriculture.
Yeah, no.
There was never a point in history.
Right, right. And so we can go back to what you call the kind of overproduction of elites. I think of this in terms of, in Unsettling of America, Wendell Berry talks about like specialization, right? And of course, some specialization is good, like somebody's going to be kind of a doctor and somebody's going to be a shoemaker and et cetera. But we've become so specialized, and that means hyper fragmented within kind of the global economy that, and part of what that requires is kind of a hierarchy of complexity, where if you're at the higher part of the hierarchy of complexity, you're really managing information, you're managing data, you have an email job, as people use. And so, in a hyper complex society, um, perhaps in the last few decades we were building for that, and so a lot of people were going to college, going to school to to be part of the priestly class of this hyper complex society, or
Yep.
but in an era of degrowth, not as a political program, but just as a
Or
biophysical reality,
deindustrialization or whatever. Yeah.
then we're in a lot of trouble because you have a lot of people who have lost practical skills. We don't really have many generalists anymore who can, deliver a baby and, build a fence and, and a barn and, make shoes for their families, right? Who can
Right.
just do
Right.
different things if they need to. Minimum viable capability.
Yeah.
Very narrow minimum viable capabilities these days. And so, yeah, this kind of pyramid of complexity and tertiary and fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh level, layers of complexity and abstraction from the real world. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this, not at this
No.
scale.
No. And then like when I think about so part of our process, or at least you've done this too, and we've done it like collapse now and avoid the rush is John Michael Greer's term. And like basically what that means to me is try to live a more simplified life that forces you to gain more skills. And when like our initial foray into this is pretty bleak in terms of like it's so bad how little we know how to do, like how little we've been taught just as
Yeah.
kids growing up. And it's not that hard to learn this stuff, but it's just very slow. It's very frustrating. A lot of people are used to like everything being instantly available and very convenient. And just the slightest amount of inconvenience when you're new to this like kind of more simple life, but that forces you to be inconvenienced, you're just like so annoyed by it. You can barely handle it. And it's almost like there's a psychological aspect and then the skills building aspect. It just makes me pretty doomer about like what else is going on with everybody else and like the younger generations too. Like having said that, if you do choose this kind of more simplified life with limitations, that you're allowing nature to put limitations on things. For example, like nobody in our 9 acres is tossing glyphosate on anything to kill. We're just pulling the weeds by hand or whatever, cutting the grass by, with whatever we need to do. But anyways, it actually is quite a nice life though, once you get through the initial frustration. And this is the optimism part, I think, that maybe just doesn't get said that explicitly, maybe because it's just like a very hard thing to communicate. But when you can enjoy some of these, more simplified ways of living, it's quite beautiful.
Yeah.
It's
I would actually say it's not a more
it's
simplified way of living. It's actually more complex. You have to be a much more rounded, better rounded individual, using different,
Yeah.
probably more parts of your brain. Um, you know, it's actually quite complex. It's almost like in order to have a objectively simpler life, in the sense that you're not as dependent on global supply chains, which is like
Yeah.
very complex, you actually have to internalize a lot of that complexity within yourself, right? You
Yeah.
can't just, you're not just ordering from DoorDash, right? You're actually growing some of the food and preparing it yourself, right? And
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
more
So it's
complexity
it
involved with that.
totally yeah. So it's totally directly related to as a society gets more simple, like individuals or household or community levels get more complex necessarily. In
Yeah,
the most complex society, your life is actually super simple. You're just doing the same thing over and over again,
right,
and you have no skills. Everything's outsourced. Yeah. Okay. That
right.
makes
You're like
sense. Yeah.
distributing the complexity.
Yeah. You're outsourcing it or externalizing.
Well, in this case,
But
I'm saying that the complexity is centralized in the sense that it's like a global supply chain. And as that phases out, your all that complexity has to be distributed to household and community and say bioregional scales, where they have to internalize a lot of that
yeah.
complexity, produce a lot more for themselves, things of that nature.
Yes. And then another thing I wanted to talk to you about besides just, well, I don't know if you have anything to add on the topic of um the life just being really lovely and beautiful and it feeling really cool to like make something yourself, or like you plant a fruit tree and 5 years later you get like your first fruit and you're like, oh my God, there's a
Yeah,
fruit.
yeah.
um
No, it
do
is.
you have
It is
anything else to say
lovely.
on that before I have another?
No, it is lovely. I mean, it's like um, it's almost like in the hyper specialized economy, we become disconnected from final causes, right? We're like a cog in a machine, and the output is so abstract and is so out there that we can't really see it. Whereas if you're directly
Yeah.
involved with, the final cause of something, of getting a return, I can think of that very much in kind of a in spiritual terms, right? Of like
Yeah.
um, seeing the fruits of your actions. I think that's a big part of it, especially coming from like academia, where you're like, say you're putting out policy reports and stuff, but like it's just so diffuse, and like it might have an impact, it might not, it doesn't, you just keep plugging away, and you
You have
know
no idea. You have no
yeah,
idea, and you're just doing some. You don't really know why you're doing it, or
yeah.
who
And I
set the
think
grant
that's just,
parameters.
yeah, I think that's major environmental mismatch. I just don't think we're built for not having feedback into our activities and our processes, besides, some I don't know, psychotic boss, like I don't know, shifting blame to you or not, or somebody else, based on their own whim.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Um. So,
I don't
but
think
then
we're built for it.
the other parameter that we I guess we try to mediate between is maybe I would call it the hippie chud spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
There's like, let's regenerate the earth, let's have like a yoga session to regenerate our bioregion. And then there's like the people who are like, you know maybe industrial farmers who are like actually out there in the ecosystem all the time, but you know maybe might be open to like more regen principles, but like it doesn't make economic sense really at this point. And so we're constantly, I feel like Doomer Optimism is constantly like in this firing squad where we're like, or we're like shooting out too towards some of these people. And it's, I don't know, it's kind of hard. There's just like so much, there's so much confusion in this time period,
Yeah.
a deindustrialized moment. Nobody really
Yeah.
knows what to do. And it's not really going to be solved by like digging your heels in industrial agriculture, and neither is it going to be solved like by doing yoga or like Reiki or whatever.
Yeah. Well, this might be like the, if we're gonna theorize idealist versus materialist split, the hippies are the idealists, and the chuds are they're the ones who actually know how to do things. right? And so,
Yeah.
um,
Yep.
if you know how to fix an engine, for example, or you do all manner of things, like, you see hippies coming along who don't really know how to do very much practically, but they know yoga.
Yeah.
I can see that being pretty hilarious. And
Yes.
this is me saying this coming from kind of, kind of a hippie background.
Meditation. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
that's
and then
true.
yeah, and then I think there is no, sorry, go ahead.
That's true. But at the same time, I think that if we're going to, you know, both be able to understand the kind of unprecedented times we live in, and transition, um, we also need some idealism, right? Like
Yeah.
we need to, you know, we also, I think, need spiritual growth, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a real thing, like developmental, adult developmental psychology. I think we all need to become more mature, as a species, to be frank. And I don't know if that's going
Yeah.
to happen or not. And so like the integralists and et cetera, I do think they're onto something there, but I think they lean too far in that direction without, becoming basically tangible creatures. There's a lot of
The
problems
thing
with
that yeah, but the thing I like the thing that I'm coming to a lot recently is I think there is like a wholesome point in the past that has a kind of social technology that we could probably both hippies and chuds agree are is like a wholesome and useful technology for this moment. And to try to like see if we can bring back those kinds of things. I was just thinking about like Kara Marshall. She was a student in my homesteading class, and she just joined her local Grange, which
Yeah.
is like a agricultural society, and she's in Connecticut in the Northeast U.S. And like, this is like an old social technology that's basically dying. That I think we could breathe some life into those of us interested and committed to like bringing more life into our local communities and more conviviality. It takes quite a bit of nuance though, and going back to your point, like people moving around so much, people moving rural, how to navigate these cultural clashes, that's the thing that I'm like is like really the thorn in my side with Doomer Optimism, because so like for example, where we live in Uruguay, it's like an ideal situation because Uruguay is this tiny country between two bigger countries. A lot of people come through here. It's also very common in Latin America to go live in the US or Europe for a while working to try to save money when you're like a young adult. So a lot of people are just extremely cosmopolitan here and very open-minded. People have family members like who spent time in other countries or they have themselves. So it's not like it's a very common thing. So people are like very, very welcoming to us. It's also like a very lucky thing that we're coming from a richer country. So everyone knows everything about US politics and culture here. So there's like an element of privilege there. And then we come in with we're both from working class families, my husband and I, Patrick. And so, so we're not like going to be snobby to local people. We also like realize that a lot of people around here have like a lot of skills that we want to learn from. So it's a pretty nice match. But that's not the case for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the onus is on the neo homesteaders, neo localists, to bring a lot of humility to the project, while also not bringing a lot of humility to it, while at the same time not being so bashful with your sense of self, right? Not being so meek that I think inevitably neo-localists are going to bring their own ideas into it, and they're going to clash. And I think just bringing as much humility as well as respect for local culture. Like that's all you can say. Like that's all you can
I
do.
know. And then the other thing that like drives me nuts is how so many people are like completely new to all of these skills. You know, you have a generation or two of people who just like didn't learn basic generalist skills,
Yeah.
and then trying to relearn them is so embarrassing.
Yeah.
And doing that out loud, you're doing such a nice service to others who are like obviously embarrassed or just trying to think about it. And I hate so much the culture of like necessarily like laughing, unless you're just like kind of laughing at yourself already. But I think people trying to, I don't know, reintegrate to nature, reintegrate to community is a good thing. And we want to encourage more of it. We don't want to laugh at it just because people are like newbies, even though that's like the human response is just to like laugh at people who are like incompetent.
Right.
Public.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's inevitable that your people are gonna scratch their head at what you're doing and think it's kind of funny. I think you just have to accept that.
Yeah.
I think the onus is on the newcomer to not try and create a parallel society.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Neil talks a lot about, of like the people coming in who like he never sees, like they don't go to their kids' schools, and so as much as possible trying to integrate with that society, and learning out loud and being embarrassed. I don't know. I just it's just going to be awkward. Like there's just no.
No, I know, but you know what? Now that you say that, like every experience I've ever had, asking somebody to teach me a skill, they're like delighted in person to show you. And when you're humble and you say you don't know what you're doing, they're delighted and they're like, "This is so great. I love showing you how to do this, and I love that you're interested to even know," because I think a lot of these skills are like downplayed, like they're not important.
Yeah.
And so I think in person that dynamic doesn't really happen as much, I think, that as online, where people are making fun of homestead stuff.
Right. And so maybe the trick is don't create an Instagram account your second day of homesteading and try and like just buckle down.
Yeah, we talked about this on a recent episode, like, and this is another question for you, I guess, or like back to our cosmological distinction. I do think it is okay to share some of your insights from your in-person life without being a narcissist, or without it turning into a narcissistic project where it's like the shadow of the thing. You're not really doing the thing, you're just doing the thing to take a picture of it, which is a real phenomenon we all know about. And I think it's one of those other things where you just have to be very tricky with, like, just be very careful and don't let it take over your life, where you're always thinking, how can I like take a picture of this or something like that, as opposed to like, no, I'm just doing the thing for itself. And then if there's a moment where I'm like, oh, I have some insight to share related to this thing, then I'll share it. But it's not like the other way around. And it's really tricky to navigate that, I think.
It is, and especially given that, oftentimes, going back to our initial discussion of why so much of us get online, is that, like we're proud of our some accomplishments, right? We have a nice garden or something, and like we want more appreciation for it, right?
Like, and nobody sees it. And that's the sad thing. What we don't have a lot of meso level interaction, actually. Like, at least in my local community, I have like friends that I see like out and about, and then I have like my home life and my husband and my kids, but like a lot of people aren't coming and going on our properties. Not necessarily, not yet. We're not like to that level of integration in the community, so it's like, hey, look what I did. Right.
And so like it's like the feeling of like, if you're showing somebody around your place and like they're not seeing the things that you want them to recognize, right? That you're proud of. It's like, look, this is actually interesting. They just like, it doesn't register because they don't have it's like tasting fine wine, right? And you either have a palate for it or you don't, right? And knowing that, putting it online, there are going to be people with a palate for it who will recognize, oh, that's cool, or will give you advice on how to improve it. And so, I
Yeah.
think, yeah, and so we're using the internet to make up for a lack of culture, basically, a lack of local
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
To kind of like almost
Yeah.
as like this kind of bridge between just complete nowhere land to try and build something for future generations, but like we're in this kind of like bridge that we're using the internet to kind of bridge, but
Yeah.
then we
Yeah.
mistake that bridge for reality, and we become addicted to that confirmation, that then it becomes addictive and troubling.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know, like just with everything now, it just takes so much nuance
Mm.
and good intuition to navigate. And it's not I mean, ideally Doomer Optimism can be like a nice place where people can go and find other people who are navigating these things with a similar amount of nuance and intuition
Yeah.
and thoughtfulness to help them. So you're not like thinking is that if you're trying to recreate an entirely different kind of simplified but more complex life, and you're having to make all of these decisions from scratch, and you're like, I don't even know how to wrap my head around the answer to this question. It's very nice to talk to other people who are like in that same mode and can like empathetically help you.
Yeah, so maybe we're like we're like a empathetic support group. Maybe that's what Dio is.
I know, yeah, for people who are like neither extreme doomers, neither extreme optimists, but like trying to live a more simple life, which in fact is incredibly more complex than whatever email job life is.
Yeah.
And
But this is
yeah,
also
and
getting, we can bridge this to, I think to the next thing that I think we're starting to try and do is, start meeting up in real life, right? With other people in the network. And hopefully that can integrate with your community. I recently made a distinction online between a network and a community. I basically saying we have to draw a clear line. Community is something where you can eat dinner with each other, right? Or it could be any embodied activity. Or else it's the network. And if you can mistake the network for your community, you're going to get in big trouble. And so, trying to convert the network, into support for these community building endeavors, either by meeting other people through the network, and then they know people in real life and you know people in real life, and then those people meet and starting to kind of like catalyze something, on the ground.
yeah,
And also I think for me, I think if I'm looking at kind of the big picture of like what are we trying to do with Doomer Optimism? What's the theory of change? I think it's that we're trying to like if we're thinking that a lot of society in the next few decades is going to have to downshift, and this is unprecedented, what is this going to look like? There's going to need to be a lot of educational, a lot of education happening, right? Like people suddenly having to get up to speed in like, how do you do this? How do you do that? And so we're kind of like, basically, I think we're preparing ourselves to be basically hosting workshops, like just to put it as simple as that, right? Where suddenly 100 people in your, county are like, oh my God, where are we food? And then 1,000 people, right? Like, how are you going to, move people through this knowledge building? It's going to have to be basically field schools, right? And so I think I kind of longer term, like where we're like, having to rediscover knowledge for ourselves that many people already know but are kind of ignored in society. So we're trying to team up with them to then be kind of to interface with a lot more people
a bridge.
that will need to learn much faster than we are.
Yes, so
let's see, you're cutting out a little bit.
I want to say oh, okay. Testing. Can you hear me now?
Now I can, yeah.
Testing, testing. Yeah, okay. So okay, to repeat back what you said, I think there is a class of newcomers to homesteading, a lot of people homeschooling, like recreating um, new ways of like education and new old ways of doing things that are more in line with a simplified downshifting future. And then there are people who still hold this embedded knowledge who haven't lost it. Whether they're farmers or small scale farmers or like old timer farmers or whatever they are. And those, I think, like I just want to explicitly say, I think are the experts needed to handle the transition of like deindustrialization.
Right.
And I don't think anyone says that explicitly enough. These are the people who know how to live with less, who we will need skills from and information from to be able to, you know, produce what we need to live well and to thrive. And the way I foresee it is, it's not like industrial civilization will go away, but it's just like there's just going to be disruptions in globalized trade that make things unstable. And then you know, it's nice to be able to rely more locally on production in a scenario where things just are like randomly breaking down. It's not like it just goes away tomorrow. The problem I see like right now is that I think that what we actually need are a bunch of workshops. But I think what actually sells are like these lifestyle camps. And it drives me crazy because nobody wants to go necessarily to like a chicken slaughtering workshop. They want to go to these like, I don't know, retreats. They want to go to a retreat. And this would like gets people signing up in the hundreds or thousands if you bring in the galaxy brains who only talk theory, or you bring in like this feel good stuff. And what I'm struggling with a little bit is like trying to explain to people how fun these physical workshop type things are, despite the fact that they're not billed as like, you know, come learn about your spiritual self or whatever, come have a transformational weekend. It is in fact transformational, but in an extremely mundane way. And I don't know how to like recruit people saying, let's just do a chicken slaughtering workshop and hang out with our friends and then everybody drink beer and play music afterwards, which is like 10 times more fun than a lot of those other lifestyle workshops.
Yeah.
You know,
well, I think that the demand is not there yet, but I think it will be.
No.
You know, for individuals who are the neo-localists, neo-homesteaders, you know, trying to get into it, I think those opportunities are available. You know, you mentioned chicken slaughtering workshop. You know, I went with Josh to on a regenerative farm to a chicken, you know, slaughtering day, and I did that for a day. I'd like to go back.
Was it fun?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was gross. I got over the grossness, right? Like, the first couple that you do are like, it's kind of like, you know, you think you're like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be traumatizing, and then it's just fine, it's fine, right? And then, but there's a lot of camaraderie, right? That's the fun part, is that everyone's like joking, and you're all just like doing it, but you're all like, you know, talking and joking, and you're getting, you know, something very tangible accomplished. And it's great. And you know, I don't think that this was the one opportunity in the world for somebody like me to do this. I think they're all over the place. Right? So going back to like, you know, let's go back to what you said of like, you know, there's people who've never lost these skills. They've dwindled in number the last few decades, but there's still people who've never lost these skills. They're the real teachers. I agree. And then perhaps the role that the neo-localists play are like, they're kind of like the bridge between the real teachers and the oblivious public, because we've been oblivious. We're starting to learn some skills, never to the degree that the real teachers are, because, you know, we didn't grow into it from when we were, you know, an infant. You know, we weren't, you know, moving cattle around at the age of 6 or whatever, right? And so we're never going to be as good, but it's like minimum viable capability.
Yep.
And so we have that kind of like ability to kind of like we've been in both worlds, and so we can kind of help provide that bridge. And both.
And you
go ahead.
You do need to translate to some extent, where you have to like sometimes an old timer will say something, not thinking that the person who's totally new to it has no idea, like any frame of reference to understand what you're saying. So like just to be able to translate some of those things, I think is also a really important skill.
Yeah, I mean, I'm experiencing that right now. Like I'm working at a part-time at a landscaping company, and one of the bosses is like this old mountain guy who has a very thick mountain accent and says the minimum possible in his mind, I think, to get the point across. And it's like half the time you don't know what he's saying, right? But after you work with him for a while, people start picking up on what he means, right? They start getting hidden, and it takes a while, but you start to speak his language, right? And what he expects you to kind of already understand. You have to say explicitly. And so, there is a translation involved, just, in a very kind of dialectic sense, but also in a, like, oh yeah, I've taken, this is so obvious to me that I take it for granted that I would even have to spell it out. And if a lot of people are going to be in the future seeking these skills, you're going to need to have translators, and people who can bridge that gap, both informationally but also culturally, right? Like, okay, you put down your kind of like, what you learned in your college class about, what's always politically correct, and et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes you just have to kind of understand that people have been living a very different reality, and there's cultural.
And also like even things like sustainability, like where people are come in and they're like, oh my God, you can't necessarily, I don't know, like we've used ant poison in our house, if it's not that big of a deal. There's certain things that the theory versus practice, I think there's going to be a lot of that. But then, can you hear me?
But in a case, I think something like permaculture is where you kind of can have an interesting synthesis of like old timer ways and traditional ways of doing things. But, there's a lot of innovation that's happening in terms of design, and, not just production of food, but water systems, energy systems. And so, the knowledge, I think, can flow both ways. And ideally, everyone, it would feel like a win-win situation for everybody where, there's just a better way to do things sometimes. But what that is has to be tested on the ground, and it has to be applicable to local context. And how you calibrate that is an interesting process, I think.
We're talking about the ideal case scenario. I foresee there just being like just tons of conflict. People are so territorial. People don't like change. People don't like migration. There's going to be tons of migration all over the place. There's also like demographic problems. Just that a lot of people aren't having kids, and so you've got a big portion of older people and not enough kids to like take care of all of those people. But having said that, I still think like the extent to which people can get into these activities, learn some self-sufficiency, connect to their neighbors, like build some local resilience is good. You did say something the other day about like these bioregional groups, and maybe you want to talk about that because you were saying that to be able to participate in your bioregional group, you're like driving all over the place, and you actually do need a bioregional group that's much smaller, I think, than what we're thinking. And it's just like we're in this weird no man's land right now where we don't have a lot of density of people doing small farm or homestead stuff necessarily
Yeah.
to like make a dense enough local group, at least not yet.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why, at least thinking backwards, I think that's one reason why it's good to focus so much on the kind of immediate, neighbors community, because that's where you can get the practice, that's where you can develop the skills.
Yeah.
I do think this larger scale coordination and collaboration is going to be necessary, but and a lot of people, I think, start with that in, say, regen network world, kind of people who call themselves, the regeneratives or whatever. They start with kind of like the bioregional scale. And I understand why they're doing that. And I'm, trying to do that. Like we just have various people, around Western North Carolina that are kind of, we have a chat group and we've tried to organize things to get together, and it hasn't really worked out yet.
Yeah.
It's too far, and then we have weather issues and whatever, and so it's frustrating and it feels disempowering. I think, having those connections even on just online is important, because I think that those connections will be valuable in the future, and collaboration will occur in the future. But it is distance is real, right? Like,
Yeah.
and having to drive everywhere to build a community is just kind of silly, right? And so that's, I'm thinking, okay, think of it more in terms of a network that you can flesh out slowly, but the
Yep.
real activity, the real complexity building is happening more locally, and that's what's
Yes.
happening at the homestead. Maybe at the county scale is like, the scale where most things are happening. And
Yeah.
it's okay to focus on
Yeah.
that.
And
That doesn't mean that you're provincial or inward focused. It just means that that's where you're fleshing out most of the blueprint for yourself and everyone else, and then those can link up later on. But you need to have like those, you need to have those foundations before those foundations can be connected to each other.
yeah, yeah. And I think it is a little bit theory brain to focus so much on bioregions. Like it is like theoretically like, oh yeah, we're in the same watershed or whatever, but like practically what do you really need to be working with people who you are like close enough to that you can maintain good friendships with, where you can actually get onto their land, where it doesn't coordination, and then you scale up. One thing I will say that's been pretty made clear to me is that we just need a lot of people taking on leadership roles.
Mhm.
In even in the sense of like, hey, let's get together, like make a group chat, tell people what's going on. I've been doing it around here where I have a group chat of like, anytime there's anything like sustainability adjacent, I like toss it into this group chat of people who I know are in Colonia in my department, where it's just like, oh yeah, there's this seed exchange, there's this workshop day, like, just keeping everybody abreast. And then maybe you cross paths, maybe you don't. There's nothing really stopping you from trying to find out what all your local like permaculture groups are, your gardening clubs, like reach out to them, get people's information and make a group chat. Like I just feel like people don't realize how much power they have to do something like that in their local community, and they're just like waiting for some kind of top down like description or somebody to tell them like, here's what we're going to do. And I personally think like take some responsibility to just like meet people who are doing things that are adjacent, get
Yeah.
their contact information, with their permission, and be in contact with them. And then another insight I think I had recently is I think like I've been too diffuse in my relationship building. Like I've been maintaining not deep friendships or acquaintances with like too many people, and not enough deep relationships with like a dozen people, or like one-on-one relationships. And I think it's a little bit like social media brain or something, where you're just like kind of diffusely relating to people but not deeply with anyone. And I think there's also something super duper powerful that we underestimate about like one-on-one relationships or small group relationships. And we were talking about, I was tweeting about this a little bit. I love this idea of this Ginto club that Benjamin Franklin had in the city of Philadelphia. It's like 8 to 12 people. And it's just like a small enough group and everybody gets together once a month and they discuss like philosophy or poetry or something. Somebody brings something to talk about, and then they talk about like what's going on in your lives basically, and what does everybody need help with. And it's like a civic organization. And there can be like a Ginto club of all mayors, it could be a Ginto club of all of us, like, in Doomer Optimism, but then there can be like a local Ginto club. I know that Nathan Gates has made one locally, an actual Ginto club, and Wendell/Wendellberry reading book club. So I just think like there is a social technology there that we should all be like taking a stronger leadership role in making happen. I don't know. I'm just like so frustrated sometimes because like I see so much online where people are like, yeah, we just need more of, we just need decentralized, regenerative future. But actually what that means is you go and talk to people and get their phone numbers and send them text messages, like in practical terms. And nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to like wait for the decentralized regenerative future enabled by cryptocurrency, or whatever.
Yeah. No, I really the DO podcast I had with Richard, what's his last name?
Flyer?
Richard Flyer. Yeah. I mean, I found his vision very pragmatic. Like he talks about kind of galaxy brain like a global commonwealth of bioregional villages or something, bioregional economies. But to him, what that means is basically you become a network catalyst in your local area. Like if you're interested in food systems, like it's not that hard to look online and see who are the big food system players in that region, from farmers, distributors, restaurants, school system, whatever. Meet with them individually first off. This is his process. Meet with them individually, talk about this idea of like a food system network, and then once you met with them on individually, then bring them all together and have like an event where you can like talk about, hey, let's improve food security or whatever it is in this region. And I mean it's a very practical vision. I mean, I think anybody, if you think on a county scale, just on a county scale, or not, doesn't have to be strictly county scale, but define, and this is also what Bradford talks about in his report, Future is Rural, is you have to define your focal area. Like, where is the area where I can have influence, where I feel like I have agency? If it's only on a family scale, that's fine. Start where you feel like you have agency, right? But for, I think if you're, if you have extra time and, you're not just worrying about surviving the next day, then you can think at a county scale. And there's a lot that you can do to just meet people, to be a catalyst. And that is, you're absolutely right. That's what a decentralized, distributed future, regenerative future, that's how it would have to start.
And I actually think a lot of, and we have, we've kind of come on like a pretty clear arc, you and I and the podcast in general, like where when we first started, we were like, let's just see what's out there. Let's talk to everybody. And I think both of us have like a skepticism, let's just make the technology and then the regeneration will follow. I think both of us seem to have come to the conclusion that it's like a lot more mundane than that. And it just requires a lot more like attention and work. And I mean, at some point we'll probably just have to end the podcast because there's nothing more to be said besides like just go and meet your neighbors and like have a chicken slaughtering party or whatever. But I feel like we've gotten a lot of insights in a short time. And I would just encourage people to, I think the other thing we try to preach a lot about is like encourage people to realize the agency that they have. you do have a lot more agency than you think. I know I've lived in the US, like it does feel like you're swimming upstream sometimes, but there are like a lot of people are like they're almost like hiding in the shadows just waiting for an invitation. People want a more humane future.
Yeah.
And I think if you try to embody what you want to see more of in the world, you have a lot more agency than you think. And I guess one other point I would make is we've had this discussion a few times on the podcast about like whether or not Doomer Optimism is explicitly political. And I think if you think about terms like your local school board and food system and like you're making real tangible change for people immediately around you and your own family by getting involved on these scales where you do have agency. And that is what it is and will be political if you decide to if you have the bandwidth to be involved in those things. I mean, people talk about like Nate again was talking about in his local area, like trying to change some local institutions. That is politics. It's like, finding a way for everybody to work together to get to these different ends. So I don't think it's necessarily non-political, but the political solution needs to be like at the correct scale and diverse and locally specific, as opposed to some political process.
It's almost like the politics that we advocate is downstream from forming relationships.
Right.
Tangible relationships. And the politics will surely come because people have different ideas about things. There's different power relationships, all of that stuff. The politics will come, but politics based on human relationships is a more deliberative form of politics than it is, which representative are you supporting this time?
Right.
And leaving it at that. That's not a very powerful form of, if we're saying democracy, that's not a very powerful form of democracy,
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so I guess final thoughts, like,
well, so this is the 100th episode.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about, highlights any episodes that you particularly liked? And then we can get into like, what do we see for the next 100 episodes if we are to have another 100 episodes?
Yeah. Okay. I am feeling really jazzed and energized by some of the people we've pulled into our orbit who I think are just really interesting thinkers. And that my favorite thing is imagining some sort of intellectual house or salon or whatever where people can like come and go. And I love the idea of Doomer Optimism, maybe virtually, maybe in person at some point, having some sort of like, my fantasy is this, like, I don't know if you've ever heard of Esalen, but this center in like Northern California in the 60s and 70s is like hippie ground zero, and everybody knew it was, and it was like anyone who was like, the top brass of thinking in that direction would be like giving a workshop at Esalen or whatever. I love the idea of like some sort of rundown Victorian Doomer Optimism mansion in West Virginia that somebody's like always manning the post, and then you can always come there and it'll be like the hub. So anyways, my like looking back, I think I love, like, I'm so glad James Pogue has become our friend. Like, he's just such a thoughtful guy. I love Donald. Like, I love these I love so much that Nate has like taken a shine to the movement, and of course anarcho-contrarian, like all of our Wendell Berry discussions. It just energizes me so much that these people are moved by the same stuff we are, and like pushing our thoughts forward and actions forward. So that I love. And then, for the next 100 episodes, I think like what energizes me again is just strengthening ties with people I think are like really cool and great. Like, I just feel so much less alone knowing like somebody like Josh Helling is out there thinking the kind of stuff that he does and doing the kind of stuff that he does. I just feel like, or like Brendan from Posterity Cider Works, he's like, he is out there literally like regenerating a landscape and making high-end cider.
Yeah.
Like it just makes me feel so warm that somebody like that exists. And these are just the ones we've happened to discover, you know. And I also think like our fan base, our listeners, not to gas everybody up, but like are like seriously some of the most thoughtful people. These DMs I get, like people are just so incredibly thoughtful and like normal in the sense of not psychotic, healthful, psychologically healthy people, which is like a rarity, you know, nowadays. So, especially on the internet. So yeah, 100 more episodes of like making friends, I guess, who I think are cool.
Nice.
You?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of, you know, again, if I'm making this distinction between network and communities, you know, I still think building up the network more, meaning that just, you know, reaching out to more people in more places, doing, you know, more interesting things, is just always a good thing to do. You know, we've talked in the past of like, you know, if we were to branch out beyond the podcast, which is, you know, Doomer Optimism at this point is mostly a podcast.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about field schools, we've talked about other media type of endeavors. We've talked about being kind of a consultancy kind of clearinghouse, connecting people who know how to do things with people who are looking to develop skills, and can compensate them for their time. We've talked about different forms of governance, like, you know, should we become like a DAO? You know, that was kind of, it's a silly kind of idea, but maybe there's something.
Or a co-op, you know, some kind of cooperative. Yeah.
Right. Some kind of cooperative. And so I think, you know, like we've talked about, like, how do we get to the next evolutionary stage if we're going to kind of keep this project going? And we haven't figured that out yet.
No.
But I think continuing to develop the network and continually in small ways to convert the network into community building, which by which I mean on the ground. You know, I think good things will come of that, right? New people, you know, we'll meet new people, and new affordances, new opportunities will arise. People will have different capacities to, or just different ideas that can help us get to the next stage.
Yeah, totally. And I guess I would just add, like, Ewan, who is at awareness with 3 S's on Twitter, hosted a Doomer Optimism camp outside of Portland, and I love like the model that what happened at this camp is what I would love to see more of, which is that he hosted a camp. They did do chicken slaughtering. People came from Portland who were like kind of adjacent to us, kind of adjacent to Teapot, and people made friends. They're like having relationships that are lasting. Some of the farmers who came, like one of them was a turkey farmer, exchanging with other people. I would love to see like 1 million times more things like this happening. And I think once that happens, then we have a coordination problem that we can help solve. But I think the activities need to ramp up, and we need to see people like interested in taking leadership and showing us that there's like a demand there for more and more of this. And then we can help, you know, maybe in an ideal scenario, some kind of clearinghouse for information, products, consulting, you know, where we're like, this is a vetted, it's not some pop-up homestead YouTube channel. It's like, you know, a legit, Roxanne Ahern's book is a legit book from a legit lady who really knows what she's talking about in terms of homesteading. And, you know, we could be a clearinghouse for that kind of thing. But we're not there yet. I still think what you're talking about, like we need to see more people, you know, taking leadership and building community as an in-person type things, is definitely important. And then even like friendships across the network, I love to see blossom, and they are blossoming, and I see them on Twitter. And that's another really good thing where people are like, I don't feel totally alone in my my community because I have this network.
And I like the potential. We've seen a little bit of it, but kind of the potential reflexive nature of the podcast, where people get inspired and then they do something interesting.
Yeah.
Because of the network, and then they become, then we like interview them, right? And then they host further conversations. And so it's kind of like, it's kind of like the activity itself will be the inspiration for more content, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which then inspires more people. Like Ewan is doing a follow-up event with some people where they're like tanning some cow hides together. And I just love
so
it. It's like it got more people involved. And then he has this center in Portland that he doesn't know what to do with. And I was like, okay, talk to these people. Like, people want to host workshops. So there's this like generating force happening in like a few key communities. And I think I just like to see more and more of that. And I'd like to empower anyone listening to do those kind of things, and then tag us and tell us when you do. Like, there's basically the only reason I'm online or doing this podcast is to help other people do these kinds of things. And so please tell us when you're doing these things. They're very inspirational to us.
Yeah. Tag at Doomer Optimism on Twitter. That's probably the best. Or at Arizona School. Or at Cognizor, either one. But and speaking of which, we need to get those Portland kids on the podcast to talk about what they're doing. See, that's already like content that fuels activity, that fuels content. And the content being, the network diffusion of innovation. That's what the content eventually should be, mostly a little bit of room for theoretical conversations, because just we have cerebral people that like to talk about cerebral things. But I think the content, action content, feedback loop should be the driver.
Yeah, and then I'm of course always scheming for in-person events, so we'll just keep your ear to the ground for those things. So I think something like more Doomer Optimism camps, like Zach said he wants to do an annual Doomer Optimism camp, if not more than annual, like season, with different activities throughout the seasons. So we should, we've got our early adopters, and we can more of those things happen.
At some point, Western North Carolina will get us back together. And we'll have, bigger activities besides one or two people visiting each other.
Once you get settled in two child household, and get things stabilized a bit, then probably it'll be a little easier. I know that for sure. When I was with really little ones, I was like, I can barely take care of myself and my household. So that's all to say. I'm very inspired by people like the Portland people or the Driftless people, because they're accomplishing a lot more than I'm able to, and so it's actually and I find it inspiring, and I'm sure other people do too, and so it's good. Like there's almost like a regional friendly competition. Yes.
That I think is good.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So, are we re-upping for another 100, or should we check back in?
Well, we already have 4. We already have like 4 additional ones in the hopper at this point.
Now we should check back in
now.
at least every 100, maybe every 50 to like, are we still doing this?
Yeah, maybe every 50 would be good. Just to make sure, just to make sure there's still purpose and vision and energy behind the project.
Yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts? I'm proud of us. 100 is a lot, and we did it in a short time.
Yeah.
And we got a lot of people energized and taking responsibility in it, which is to me like the biggest gift. It's not just like
it didn't feel like a lot of work for me, or for I don't think for you, because so many people took initiative, so many people organized interviews, hosted. We've put out 100 in just over a year, because so many people are buying in, right? And that's the way.
Yeah, totally. All right, well, I'm going to take a little break from recording for a little while, so I'll see you all when I see you.
All right, take care. Bye. 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 Bye.
Okay, bye.